I never thought a day could end the way that one did. I remember standing in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. Outside, the rain had started falling in a quiet drizzle, tapping gently against the window like it was trying to wake me from some deep, unshakable sleep. My coffee had gone cold in the mug I had forgotten to drink. And then I heard it, the small, sharp voice of my own son, saying words I never imagined I would hear. "Dad, you're not really my father." Those words hit me like a fist in the chest. I froze. I wanted to ask him to repeat it, to tell me it wasn't true. But I didn't. I just stood there, staring at the steam that no longer rose from my coffee, feeling a quiet, empty ache spread through my chest. How could the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the one who had held my hand on his first day of school, look at me and say that? I tried to speak. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. I wanted to yell. I wanted to beg. I wanted to explain. But all I could do was swallow and nod, silently agreeing to the distance he felt, a distance I hadn't even noticed growing. And that was the moment I realized. I had already lost him, long before he said those words. It hadn't started here, not really. The cracks had been forming slowly, quietly, in ways I hadn't paid attention to. A missed soccer game here, a forgotten school project there. I thought I was doing everything right, working hard, providing for my family, keeping a roof over their heads, but I had missed something far more important. I had missed them. I remembered the nights I came home exhausted from work, collapsing into the sofa with my briefcase at my feet. My wife would be there, tired but smiling, and my kids would run past me, barely acknowledging my presence. I thought it was normal. I thought it was enough. But it wasn't. It was never enough. The next morning, the tension didn't go away. My son wouldn't look at me during breakfast. His fork moved mechanically, and the silence between us was heavy, thick enough to feel like it could crush me. I wanted to ask what had changed, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. As I sat there, staring at the untouched cereal in front of him, memories started flooding in, small, ordinary memories that now felt like missed chances. His first day at kindergarten. I had been late. His first lost tooth. I had been on a business call. His first baseball game. I had promised I would be there, but traffic held me back. And now, all of those moments seemed like they had built an invisible wall between us, a wall I didn't even realize existed until it was too late. Later that day, I found myself alone in the living room, the rain now heavier, drumming against the roof. I sat on the edge of the sofa and let the silence fill the space, listening to the faint sound of my own heartbeat. I thought about the boy who had once run to me with scraped knees and a scraped heart, expecting me to fix everything. I had fixed the scraped knees, yes, but I had never fixed the emotional cracks. I had never been there when it mattered the most. And that's when I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let this go any further. I would try, somehow, to reach him again. But I didn't know how. Every word I considered felt too heavy. Every gesture felt too small. And I realized that love, no matter how deep, isn't always enough when it's unspoken. The days that followed were quieter than I had expected. My wife tried to fill the gaps with explanations I couldn't quite hear. "He just needs time," she said softly, as if time alone could mend what had been broken. But I knew better. I had learned that love left unexpressed can feel like absence, and absence can feel permanent. One evening, I walked past his room and paused. The light was on, casting a warm glow that contrasted with the chill in my heart. I could hear him speaking softly into his phone, laughing quietly. A part of me wanted to turn away, to retreat into the comfort of silence, but another part, the part that still hoped, whispered that it wasn't too late. I knocked lightly on the door. "Hey, can we talk?" I said. My voice sounded strange, foreign even, to my own ears. He didn't respond at first. I waited, holding my breath, the seconds stretching into something unbearable. Finally, he opened the door just a crack. His eyes were wary, guarded. I saw a flash of something familiar there, the boy I had known, but it was shadowed by doubt and hurt. I want to understand," I said quietly. "I know I've missed a lot, but I want to try." He looked at me for a long moment. I thought I saw the slightest softening, the tiniest crack in the armor he had built around himself. And then, without another word, he closed the door. It was a small gesture, almost nothing, but it was the first opening I had gotten in months, maybe years. And I clung to it, like a lifeline thrown across a stormy sea. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen again. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a quiet that felt almost sacred. I poured myself a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise slowly, and I realized something. I didn't just want my son back. I needed him. Not for pride, not for recognition, not for comfort. I needed him because a life without connection is a life half-lived. And I had been living only half my life for far too long. I didn't know then how long it would take, or if I would ever fully repair what had been broken. But I knew one thing with certainty. I would not give up. Not now. Not ever. Because sometimes, love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes, it's about showing up again and again, even when the door stays closed. And that was when the accident happened. I can still remember the sound of screeching tires, the sudden chaos, and then, the fear, sharp and piercing, that made my chest tighten. I ran without thinking, the rain now cold and heavy, soaking through my clothes. And there he was, lying there, small and fragile in the middle of the road, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Time slowed. Everything slowed. And in that moment, all the walls, all the distance, all the unspoken words, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was that he was there, and I was there, and we were both alive. I scooped him up, holding him close, and he whispered, trembling, "Dad, I'm scared." I held him tighter than I ever had, tears mixing with the rain. "I know, son. I know," I whispered back. "I'm here. I've always been here." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning, a first step toward the repair, toward the love I had failed to show for so long. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a fragile, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. I sat with him that night, long after the storm had passed. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, the soft tick of the clock on the wall, and the occasional groan of the old wooden floors. I watched him sleep in the small bed we had once shared stories in, the same bed where I had once tucked him in and promised him that the world would always be safe. It was strange and painful to realize that those stories, those promises, had faded into memory while the reality had become so distant. I thought about the years in between, the birthdays I had missed because of deadlines, the soccer games I had skipped for meetings, the evenings I spent staring at my phone while he sat silently in the next room. I told myself I was working for them, for their future. But I now understood the bitter truth. No paycheck, no promotion, no material comfort could ever replace the moments I had let slip away. Time doesn't wait for anyone. Children don't wait for their fathers. And love, unspoken, can wither quietly like a flower left in the dark. I remembered the way he used to run into my arms after school, the small handprints he left on my work shirts, the silly drawings he would present proudly with crayons smeared across the page. And I remembered how, over time, those drawings stopped. The handprints stopped. The laughter stopped. Not all at once, not in a dramatic explosion, but slowly, like the tide receding until only footprints remained, footprints I could no longer reach. The accident had shaken something inside both of us. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw me, the part of me that had been hiding behind work, behind pride, behind the noise of life. And I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in years, not as a child, not as a responsibility, not as a reflection of my mistakes, but as a person with fears, hopes, and the quiet longing to be understood. I stayed by his side through the night, holding his small hand in mine, feeling the warmth and fragility of it. "I'm not going anywhere," I whispered repeatedly, though he was too exhausted to respond. I wanted him to feel it in his bones, in every heartbeat, in every shallow breath, that despite everything, I was there, fully, finally, without distraction, without distance. That night, memories came flooding back in waves, not just of him, but of our family before the distance crept in. I thought of my wife, smiling at the small victories we once celebrated, the way our house smelled like fresh bread on Sunday mornings, the lazy afternoons we spent together in the backyard, the sun warm on our skin, laughter spilling over like sunlight itself. Those moments felt distant now, almost dreamlike. But the ache they left behind was real, and I carried it with me like a scar I couldn't hide. I began to remember the quiet warnings, the small signs I had ignored. His reluctance to share his day, the subtle shrug when I asked about school, the way his eyes would dart away when I tried to connect. I had thought it was just growing up, just the natural push of independence. But it was more than that. It was a silent plea for attention, for presence, for recognition. And I had failed to answer it, or even notice it, for too long. The next morning, he woke slowly, still pale from the scare, but awake. He didn't speak at first, just watched me, eyes wide and cautious. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but I also wanted to give him space. So I sat quietly at the edge of the bed, simply present. I didn't speak. I didn't force conversation. I just let him feel that I was there. And after what felt like an eternity, he murmured, barely above a whisper, "Dad, I'm sorry." I blinked, caught off guard. Not because of the apology, though I had longed to hear it, but because of the weight behind it. He wasn't apologizing for the accident. He was apologizing for the years of silent distance, for the unspoken hurt, for the moments we had both lost. And in that moment, I realized something important. It wasn't about blame. It wasn't about fault. It was about reconnection, about understanding, about slowly rebuilding what had been broken. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly feel everything. Regret, sadness, love, hope. "I'm sorry too," I whispered back. "For everything I missed, for everything I didn't see. I'm sorry." We spent the day together, quietly, without pressure. I watched him play, watched him talk softly about small things, about friends, about schoolwork, about nothing important and everything important all at once. I realized that these were the moments I had been chasing all along. The everyday, ordinary moments that carried the weight of connection, the glue of love, the pulse of a family. And I had nearly let them slip away forever. By evening, there was a shift. A small one, almost imperceptible, but real. He looked at me not as a distant figure, not as someone absent in his life, but as someone present. Someone who cared enough to stop, to listen, to hold, to be there. And in that quiet acknowledgement, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. Not just my belonging to him, but his belonging to me and ours to each other. That night, as he slept again, I stayed up in the dim kitchen, poring over old photographs, old mementos, the fragments of a life I had taken for granted. I laughed quietly at old memories and cried softly for the ones I had missed. And I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that love is patient, but it is also fragile. It can survive neglect, distance, and mistakes, but only if someone decides to fight for it, to show up when it matters the most. The accident didn't erase the years we had lost. It didn't fix everything, and it didn't erase the hurt. But it reminded us both of something essential. The threads of connection are still there, even if they've frayed. And if we are willing to tend to them, slowly and carefully, they can be rewoven into something stronger, something lasting, something real. And that's where it began. Not with grand apologies, not with speeches or tears, but with presence, with small gestures, with a quiet understanding that we had one another, and that was enough to start again. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. And for the first time in years, I felt the possibility of tomorrow not as a weight, but as a promise. I remember those mornings, quiet and ordinary, yet somehow full of life. The sun would filter through the kitchen curtains in soft beams, scattering light across the old wooden table. My wife would already be up, humming a tune as she made coffee, her movements familiar and comforting. The smell of toasted bread and brewing coffee would fill the room, mingling with the faint aroma of her perfume, and the house would feel alive, even before my kids appeared. Our son, still groggy from sleep, would shuffle into the kitchen, hair messy and pajamas wrinkled. "Morning, Dad," he would mumble, voice rough from sleep, barely opening his eyes. I'd smile, ruffle his hair, and hand him a plate with scrambled eggs and toast. He'd sit quietly, sometimes talking about a dream he had, sometimes lost in his own world, and I'd watch him, savoring these small, fleeting moments. My daughter was always the early riser. She would bound into the kitchen, bright-eyed and eager, asking endless questions about the day ahead, about school, about what we might do after work, about the smallest things that somehow felt monumental. "Dad, are we having pancakes this week?" she would ask, her voice bubbling with curiosity. And I would smile, sometimes nod, sometimes laugh, and promise her that yes, we would, even if I had no idea when I'd actually find the time. I loved these mornings because they were ours. They were unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, they were everything. I could see the world reflected in my children's eyes, bright and open, full of hope. And I could see the life I had built, a simple life, quiet, imperfect, but ours. Work was another story. I had a job that demanded long hours, endless meetings, and responsibilities I couldn't leave behind at the office. But I tried, always, to make the transition home meaningful. Sometimes I failed. Most times I failed. But there were those rare moments, a bedtime story, a joke shared over dinner, a quiet walk together, where it felt like nothing else mattered. Just the warmth of being present. I remember one afternoon in particular, the air still heavy with the scent of rain. My son and I were in the living room, assembling a small model airplane. He was meticulous, carefully placing each piece, while I fumbled, trying to keep up. "Dad, you're doing it wrong," he said, pointing at a piece I had snapped into the wrong slot. "I know," I said with a smile. "I just like to keep you on your toes." He rolled his eyes but laughed, and for a brief moment, the distance that had grown between us in the past years seemed non-existent. We were just father and son, sharing something small, ordinary, yet profound. And then there were the evenings, the ones that felt slow and soft, like a gentle sigh at the end of the day. We would sit together on the porch, watching the sky shift from gold to pink to deep indigo. My daughter would trace patterns on the railing, humming a tune she had learned at school. My son would lean against my shoulder, tired from the day, silent but comfortable in the closeness. And I would think about how fleeting these moments were, how quickly the world would intrude, how easily life could pull us apart if I wasn't careful. There were ordinary arguments, of course, disagreements over homework, chores, or bedtime. Moments when my patience ran thin, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to slow down, to remember that they were children learning their place in the world. But even those moments were tempered with love. Even in frustration, I never doubted the bond we shared. I tried, in my own quiet way, to make sure my children always felt safe, loved, and seen. I'd pack their lunches with little notes tucked inside, reminding them that I was proud, that I loved them, that I believed in them. I'd cheer at their games, even if my own energy was spent, even if the traffic on the way had nearly made me late. And on special nights, when the stars were out and the world felt hushed, I'd tell them stories, not the fantastical kind, but real stories about our family, about small lessons learned, about the times I had made mistakes and how I had tried to fix them. Those stories were important. I wanted them to understand that life wasn't perfect, that love wasn't always easy, that sometimes even fathers made mistakes, but that even in imperfection, there was hope, there was warmth, there was connection. Weekends were different. They were sacred. No work calls, no emails, no urgent tasks pulling me away. Just us. We would go to the park, sometimes just walking, sometimes running, sometimes playing catch. The joy on their faces was a kind of medicine I didn't realize I needed until I saw it reflected back at me. I remember one Saturday in particular, the sun bright but not harsh, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. My son had just learned to ride his bike without training wheels. I had run alongside him, holding the seat, running faster than my body wanted, until finally, he wobbled on his own and then steadied himself. "Dad, look, I'm doing it," he shouted, eyes wide with triumph. I laughed, my chest tight with pride, and let go, letting him ride ahead. He didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He rode, steady and strong. And in that moment, I realized that all the long hours, the mistakes, the small failures, they were worth it for this. For moments like this. For the chance to see my children grow, to guide them, to watch them become their own people, even if it meant letting go a little at a time. But life, as I was slowly learning, had a way of reminding me that nothing lasts untouched. Even in the calmest, happiest moments, change lurks nearby. The quiet mornings, the laughter-filled afternoons, the peaceful evenings, they are all fragile. They can slip through your fingers when you're not paying attention. And sometimes, you don't realize what you've lost until it's nearly gone. I thought of my wife during these times. The quiet, steady presence she had been throughout our years together. Her patience, her humor, her love for our children, and even for me, flawed as I was, had been a constant in my life. I admired her more than I ever said. I feared losing her, even as I sometimes let my work or my pride push her away. I knew that the family we had built, this ordinary, imperfect life, was because of both of us. And I clung to that truth whenever the days felt heavy or the arguments sharp. Evenings at home were simple, but meaningful. We'd eat dinner together, talk quietly about the day, the little wins, the small setbacks. Sometimes there were stories shared over mashed potatoes and gravy. Sometimes there were silences, comfortable, not forced. And I learned to cherish both, the words and the quiet, because they were proof that we were still connected. And yet, beneath it all, a faint unease lingered. A whisper I couldn't quite name. A subtle tension that sometimes surfaced in the corners of conversations, in the pauses between questions, in the way my son would avoid my gaze for just a moment too long. I didn't understand it then. I told myself it was normal, that children grow distant at times, that life is busy and complicated. But a part of me, the part that feared losing them despite everything I had tried, felt the shift. Something had begun, quietly, slowly, before either of us realized it. That was the world we lived in, warm, full of love, but fragile, delicate, like a glass ornament balanced on the edge of a shelf. One wrong move, one unnoticed crack, and it could shatter. I had no idea how close we were to that edge. I remember the first time my son invited a friend over after school. It was a small thing, really, just another ordinary Tuesday, but it meant the world to him. I watched them in the living room, sprawled on the floor with Legos scattered all around, laughing and arguing over who had the best creation. I tried to join in, to make jokes, to be part of their world, but I noticed my son's friend looking at me strangely, like I didn't quite belong. It stung, but I reminded myself that I was just learning to be part of his growing life, a life that now extended beyond me, beyond my presence. Later, when his friend left, my son and I sat together quietly. "Dad," he said softly, "you don't get it sometimes." His eyes were not angry, but reflective, serious, almost older than his years. I nodded slowly, unsure of what he meant. "I'm trying," I said. "I really am." And in that moment, I felt a gentle weight settle in my chest, the awareness that love and effort aren't always the same. Sometimes effort is seen, sometimes it isn't. My daughter had her own world too. School projects, art assignments, little dramas with friends, moments of triumph, moments of hurt. She would come home, often talking a mile a minute, and I would listen. I would try to remember the small details, the names of friends, the stories of her day. But sometimes I would get distracted by my phone, by an email, by a thought of work, and I knew she noticed. Kids always notice. And even if they don't say it, the distance builds, quietly, like dust accumulating in a corner. I remembered my own childhood during those evenings. My father had been a quiet man, hard-working, stoic, never one for words, yet full of lessons. I had loved him deeply, but I had also felt the absence of certain moments, the missed talks, the unasked questions, the silent evenings where understanding could have been shared but wasn't. I realized I was living some of the same patterns. I had promised myself I would be different, more present, more attentive. And yet, despite my best intentions, I sometimes fell short. I remember the day my son came home from school, frustrated, slamming his backpack on the floor. "Dad," he said, eyes blazing, "why do you never ask how my day was? You're always gone." I felt the sting of his words, sharper than I expected. I'm sorry," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I want to know about your day. Tell me now." And so he did, slowly at first, then with more energy, as he shared the little victories, the small annoyances, the moments of pride and embarrassment that made up a child's life. I listened, really listened, trying to erase the memory of my absence, if only for that moment. School events were another window into the life I sometimes missed. Parent-teacher meetings, performances, games, I attended when I could, but often my work kept me away. I knew the teachers appreciated my presence, but my children noticed my absences more. I tried to make up for it with words, gestures, and promises. But words are fragile when not backed by presence. I learned that slowly, painfully, watching the subtle disappointments in their eyes. Even weekends, though better, were not perfect. Errands, chores, repairs around the house. These small, mundane tasks often intruded upon our time together. I would fix the leaky faucet while my son tried to show me a new trick he had learned on his skateboard. I would fold laundry while my daughter whispered stories about her school play. I would try to split my attention, to be present in multiple worlds at once, but the constant juggling sometimes left me feeling empty. There were also little victories, moments that reminded me why all the effort mattered. Watching my daughter master a new skill, seeing my son help a younger friend, hearing laughter echo through the house in the late afternoon. These moments were small, but they built a life that mattered. They were the threads that connected us, delicate but strong. Family dinners, too, were ritual and therapy combined. We would gather around the table, share stories, ask questions, and laugh. Sometimes disagreements arose, a spilled drink, a missed chore, a sharp word spoken in haste. But even then, I tried to remind myself that connection mattered more than perfection. That love could carry through mistakes if we were willing to show it, to acknowledge it, to repair it gently. I also watched how my children were growing, how their personalities emerged, how their independence became more pronounced. My son was curious, adventurous, sometimes reckless, always testing boundaries. My daughter was thoughtful, imaginative, full of questions, and not afraid to challenge me with her observations. Each day, they were becoming more themselves, and I had to learn to step back while remaining present. It was a delicate balance, a lesson in patience, in restraint, in love expressed through quiet support rather than control. At times, I would catch myself reflecting on the small regrets that had accumulated. Days I had been late, promises I had forgotten, words I had failed to say. The memory of these moments was bittersweet, painful, but also instructive. They reminded me that life is made up of small actions, and that every day presents an opportunity to choose presence over distraction, love over indifference. One evening, my wife and I sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. The sky was painted in muted shades of twilight, the air cool and fragrant with the scent of rain. "We're doing okay," she said softly, leaning against me. "Better than okay," I replied, taking her hand. We talked about the children, about our hopes, about the little ways we could nurture connection despite the pressures of work and life. It was a quiet moment, but it meant everything. And yet, even in these peaceful routines, there were hints of the tension to come. I noticed the way my son sometimes hesitated before answering, the way my daughter occasionally withdrew into her own thoughts. These were subtle signals, easily dismissed, but they carried weight. The life we had built was strong, yes, but delicate. Every missed word, every overlooked emotion, every moment of distraction left a mark. And I had to learn to pay attention before those marks became cracks. The beauty of our life lay in the ordinary. The spilled milk, the scraped knees, the forgotten homework, the laughter and tears, all of it formed the tapestry of our existence. And I loved it, deeply, with all my heart. But I also knew that love alone was not always enough. Connection required action, awareness, presence. And I had only begun to understand the depth of that lesson. As the setup drew to a close, I realized something important. Life doesn't wait. Children grow, moments pass, opportunities vanish. And the quiet, ordinary days, which feel so abundant in the moment, are precious precisely because they are fleeting. I had to hold on to them, to treasure them, to live them fully, or risk losing them forever. I started noticing it slowly, in the smallest of ways. A shrug when I asked a question, a quick glance away, a half-smile that didn't reach the eyes. My children were still there, physically, still talking, still laughing, but something had shifted, something I couldn't name at first. And the more I tried to understand it, the more elusive it became. My son, once eager to share his day, had begun retreating into himself. He would answer questions with one-word responses or silence, his eyes often staring somewhere beyond me, as if the world outside was more interesting than the world I was trying to offer him. One evening, I asked softly, "How was school today?" He mumbled, "Fine," without looking up from the game on his tablet. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, trying not to feel the sting of rejection. My daughter, usually so expressive, began keeping secrets in small ways. The whispers with friends in the backyard, the hidden notes under her pillow, the sudden bursts of frustration over seemingly minor things. They were all subtle signs that our family, our carefully nurtured bond, was beginning to fracture. I wanted to confront them, to ask what was wrong, to fix it. But every time I tried, I hesitated. I feared the answers I might receive, and so I remained silent, hoping the distance would close on its own. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, the sound of the rain tapping against the window a constant reminder of the quiet tension that had settled in the house. I watched my son pace in his room, slamming the door behind him, and my daughter sitting at her desk, scribbling furiously in her notebook. I felt powerless, as if I were standing on the edge of a river, watching the current pull my family further apart, unable to reach across and stop it. It wasn't just them. I began noticing my own shortcomings in sharper detail. How often had I chosen work over presence? How many times had I promised to attend a game, a recital, or a simple dinner, only to let something else take priority? I kept a mental list of my failures, and it grew longer each day, a silent condemnation I couldn't escape. One evening, my son confronted me, words sharper than I expected. "Dad, you don't get it. You're always somewhere else. Even when you're here, you're not really here." I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to explain that I was doing everything I could. But his words were simple and undeniable. I was absent, even in presence, and he saw it. I'm trying," I said, my voice quiet, almost breaking. "I really am." "You always say that," he replied, voice tinged with frustration, "but it never feels like it." His words lingered in the air long after he left the room. I sank into the sofa, feeling the weight of failure settle around me. I had spent years believing that providing for my family, working hard, keeping the house running, was enough. But it wasn't. Presence mattered. Attention mattered. And I had given them too little of both. At times, it wasn't even words that showed the distance. It was small gestures, unnoticed by most. The way my daughter would retreat when I entered the room. The way my son would lock his bedroom door after school. The way laughter in the house felt muted, quieter than it once had. I tried to ignore it, convince myself that it was normal, that children grow distant in stages, that all would be well. But deep down, I knew better. I had missed the early warnings, and now the cracks were widening. My wife noticed it too. She would glance at me during dinner, eyes filled with quiet worry, and whisper, "We need to talk to them before it's too late." I nodded, unsure what to say, unsure how to fix something that seemed to have grown out of my own mistakes. She carried her own burdens silently, balancing work, household duties, and the weight of our children's emotional distance. We were partners, yes, but even in partnership, there were moments when words weren't enough. One afternoon, I overheard my son on the phone with a friend. He spoke in a tone I barely recognized, frustrated, withdrawn, almost resentful. He said, "My dad, he just doesn't get it. He's always busy." The words cut deeper than any argument could. I felt a pang of guilt so sharp that I had to sit down. That was the reality, not a fleeting annoyance, not a misunderstanding, but a quiet, growing rift that I had helped create, even if unintentionally. The rising tension manifested in other ways, too. Homework left incomplete, chores forgotten, small acts of defiance or silence. I tried to address them calmly, but each conversation felt like walking on thin ice. One wrong word, one misjudged gesture, and the fragile bond we had might shatter further. I became hyper-aware, cautious, careful with every sentence. But caution is not the same as connection, and I learned, slowly, painfully, that no amount of caution could replace genuine presence. Even my attempts to bond were sometimes met with resistance. I tried to invite my children on weekend outings, simple trips to the park, bike rides, or even just a walk around the neighborhood. My son would nod politely but withdraw into himself. My daughter would agree, then get distracted, complaining about something small or showing disinterest. I felt invisible, like a shadow in my own home, longing to be seen, longing to be part of their world again. It was during this time that small misunderstandings began to pile up. A missed pickup from school, a forgotten lunch, an overlooked conversation. Each seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed a wall between us. I tried to knock on it gently, offering apologies, explanations, and promises. But walls, once built, are stubborn, and children, even unintentionally, can reinforce them with silence or distance. One evening, my daughter came to me quietly, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, why don't you ever ask me how I'm feeling?" she whispered. My throat tightened. I knelt beside her, taking her hands in mine. I'm sorry, I said softly. I should have asked. I want to know always. Can you tell me now? She hesitated, then let the words spill slowly, sharing worries, fears, small hurts. I listened, heart heavy with regret and gratitude. It was a reminder that even in rising conflict, connection was possible, fragile, tentative, but still there. And yet, the tension was undeniable. My son's sharp words, my daughter's silent withdrawals, my wife's worried glances, they all pointed to a truth I could no longer avoid. The life we had built, ordinary and warm as it had been, was facing the quiet, relentless strain of distance. And I realized that no amount of love alone could repair it. Action was required. Presence, patience, and the courage to face the consequences of my past absences. Even in the calm moments, the undercurrent of conflict was there. I could feel it in the pauses, in the hesitations, in the way small disagreements escalated more quickly than before. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. But it was there, like a storm forming quietly on the horizon, inevitable and approaching. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet tension in our home grew heavier. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no yelling matches or slammed doors, at least not beyond what a normal household might expect. But the silences, the sidelong glances, the unasked questions, they carried weight. They were the kind of weight that settles into your chest without warning, pressing down slowly until it feels impossible to breathe fully. I noticed my son spending more time in his room. He would retreat there immediately after school, headphones on, sometimes drawing the blinds to shut out the world. I tried to knock lightly, to ask how he was doing, but he would answer with a short, clipped, "I'm fine," and I knew it meant anything but that. I could sense the storm behind those words, the frustration, the hurt, the quiet resentment of a child who felt unseen. My daughter, too, began withdrawing in subtle ways. She would sit at the kitchen table after school, staring at a notebook, her pen moving furiously across the page, but not speaking to anyone. When I tried to engage her, asking about her day or her friends, she would shrug or mumble, then return to her writing. I realized that silence had become her shield, a way to protect herself from the absence she felt in my presence. Even my wife seemed affected, though she never complained outright. I caught her watching me during these quiet moments, eyes heavy with concern, as if she could see the cracks forming that I had yet to acknowledge fully. Sometimes she would reach out, touching my arm lightly, or whisper, "We'll figure it out," and I would nod, pretending I knew how. The truth was, I didn't. I was just beginning to see the consequences of years of good intentions mixed with absent-minded neglect. There were minor confrontations, too. One evening, my son came down to the kitchen, face flushed. "Dad, why don't you ever notice when something's wrong?" he asked, voice shaking. I froze, unsure how to answer. I try," I said slowly, feeling the weight of my own failures. "I really do." He shook his head. "It doesn't feel like it." The words hit me harder than any angry outburst could. I wanted to explain, to justify, to tell him that work and responsibilities hadn't meant that I didn't care. But I knew that words alone weren't enough. Presence mattered more than explanation. Love mattered more than excuses. And I had given too little of both. There were small incidents at school that mirrored the tension at home. Parent-teacher meetings revealed subtle issues I hadn't noticed before. My son was quieter than usual, less engaged in class. My daughter seemed distracted, struggling to express herself. Teachers spoke gently, cautiously, but their words carried a warning. Children notice more than we realize, and absence, even if unintentional, leaves a mark. One evening, my wife and I sat together after the children had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the room. "We can't keep ignoring this," she said softly. "They're pulling away from us." "I know," I admitted, my voice low. "I see it. I feel it. I don't know how to fix it." She reached out, holding my hand. "You have to try. Every day. In every way." And I tried. I made small gestures, quiet efforts to reconnect. I asked my son about school, even when he muttered one-word answers. I complimented my daughter on her drawings, even when she rolled her eyes. I tried to listen more than I spoke. I tried to be present in ways that weren't flashy or dramatic, because I understood that healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from consistency, from showing up even when it's hard. But it wasn't easy. Resistance lingered, subtle but persistent. My children had grown accustomed to a distance I had created, and breaking through it required patience I sometimes lacked. I had moments of frustration, of self-doubt, wondering if I had waited too long, if the opportunity to rebuild was slipping through my fingers. One evening, my son confronted me again, a little sharper this time. "Dad, you don't even try half the time. You say you care, but your actions say otherwise." I felt the sting, a mixture of guilt and shame. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I'm really trying." He looked at me, eyes searching, then turned away. "It doesn't feel like it," he muttered. Even small misunderstandings became charged with emotion. A forgotten chore, a missed assignment, an offhand comment. Each carried a weight that it never had before. The house felt quieter, heavier, the laughter softer, the silences longer. I realized that the life we had built, once so warm and full, was slowly being overshadowed by unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. Yet, amid all this tension, there were still glimpses of hope. Moments when my daughter would lean against me while watching a movie, or my son would ask a question about something he learned in school, inviting conversation. These moments reminded me that connection wasn't lost. It was just buried beneath layers of hurt and distance. And I knew that if I persisted, with patience and presence, those layers could be peeled back. I also began reflecting more deeply on my own behavior, on the patterns I had inherited from my childhood. My father, a quiet, stoic man, had loved me, yes, but had been absent in ways I hadn't understood until I became a parent myself. I realized that some of my own absences were echoes of his, repeated unknowingly. And the knowledge that I could break the cycle, that I could choose to be present, to truly see and hear my children, became a guiding force in the midst of the rising conflict. Even as tension built, I tried to maintain small routines that kept us connected: weekend breakfasts, quiet walks in the park, short bedtime talks. They were imperfect, sometimes met with reluctance or indifference, but they were threads of connection, fragile but real. I clung to them, knowing that rebuilding trust and intimacy would take time, effort, and persistence. Yet, the distance was undeniable. It lingered in the corners of conversations, in the half-hearted responses, in the quiet withdrawals. I could feel it pressing against me, a reminder that love, though powerful, requires action, attention, and presence to survive. And I was determined, more than ever, to rise to that challenge, even if it meant confronting my own shortcomings and enduring moments of discomfort, guilt, and self-reflection. It happened on a Thursday, a day like any other at first. The sky was gray, and the faint chill of early evening pressed against the windows. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when my son's voice called from upstairs. "Dad, can I talk to you?" I froze. The tone of his voice was different, quieter, heavier, as if something important had settled there, and it was about to be shared. I set the sponge down, wiped my hands, and followed the sound of his footsteps to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed, eyes downcast, hands twisting together nervously. "What's on your mind, buddy?" I asked gently, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer at first. He just stared at the floor, and I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against both of us. The room was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the distant sound of traffic outside. I sat on the bed beside him, letting him know I was present, that I was listening, without rushing him. Finally, he lifted his eyes to mine, and what I saw there stopped me cold. Hurt, confusion, and a quiet anger I hadn't noticed before. "Dad, I don't know if I want to live here anymore," he said, voice trembling. The word struck me like a sudden blow. My chest tightened, and for a moment I could barely breathe. What do you mean?" I whispered, trying to steady myself. "I mean, I don't feel like you're really my dad," he said, voice breaking. "Not really. You're always gone, or distracted, or I don't know. I don't feel like I belong here." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to explain, to justify, to tell him that I loved him, that I had always loved him. But in that moment, words felt meaningless. The truth of his hurt was undeniable, and I realized that my years of distraction, my attempts to make up with occasional gestures, had not been enough. I'm sorry," I whispered, voice low. "I didn't realize. I didn't see how much you were hurting." He looked at me, eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of our distance reflected back at me. "It's too late for sorry," he said softly. And then he left the room, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there, stunned, unable to move. The quiet of the room felt suffocating. I wanted to chase him, to tell him I loved him, that he belonged, that he was my son. But I also knew that chasing him now might push him further away. All I could do was stand there, feeling the emptiness of the space he had left behind. Later that evening, my wife and I sat together in silence. She had seen the confrontation from the doorway, her eyes filled with worry and a quiet sorrow. "We can't let this go," she said finally. "Something's happening, and we need to face it." "I know," I said, voice barely above a whisper. I failed him. I didn't see it until now. And that was the moment I realized. Everything had changed. The calm, ordinary life we had built, the routines, the laughter, the quiet warmth of small gestures, it was no longer enough. The cracks I had ignored, the silences I had dismissed, the moments I had missed, had accumulated into a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. The days that followed were heavy. My son became even more withdrawn, speaking less and retreating further into his room. My daughter, sensing the tension, grew quiet, hesitant, careful with her words. Even my wife, ever patient, seemed weighed down by the unspoken pain that had settled into the corners of our home. Then came the phone call. It was from the school. My son had made a decision, one that shocked me to my core. "Your son has requested to transfer to a foster home temporarily," the voice on the other end said, clinical and detached. "It seems he feels disconnected from his current environment and needs support." I felt my knees go weak. I gripped the counter, trying to steady myself. "Foster home," I whispered, almost to myself. The world tilted, a dizzying vertigo of disbelief, fear, and heartbreak crashing over me. How had it come to this? How had I missed every warning, every subtle cry for attention, every small sign that he was slipping away from us? My wife put a hand on my shoulder, her touch steady, grounding. "We have to be strong," she said softly. "We have to fight for him, for all of them." I nodded, but inside I felt hollow. The thought of my son leaving our home, even temporarily, was unbearable. I thought of the years we had shared, the mornings, the evenings, the ordinary moments of love and connection, now threatened by the consequences of my absence. That night, I sat alone in the living room, rain tapping against the windows, dim light casting shadows across the room. I thought about every missed game, every overlooked conversation, every time I had chosen work over presence. I felt the weight of regret pressing down, heavier than I had ever imagined. And I realized that life, fragile and fleeting, had a way of demanding attention before it was too late. The turning point wasn't dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no shouts, no fights, no explosive confrontations. It was quiet, subtle, almost unbearable in its simplicity. The moment I saw the full consequences of my distance, of my unintentional neglect, of my absence. And it changed me. I spent the next days reaching out, gently, cautiously. Letters, small gestures, quiet conversations, attempts to show presence without pressure. I apologized, not just with words, but with action, with effort, with a commitment I had never fully understood until that moment. I remember sitting with him in the hospital room, the foster home waiting forms and signed, the air heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. I held his hand, soft and trembling, and whispered, "I'm here. I won't let go. I'll be here every step of the way." For the first time in a long while, he looked at me fully. No shields, no distance, just his eyes, wary, cautious, but searching. "Dad," he said softly, I just want someone to see me." And I understood. That was all he needed. To be seen, to be acknowledged, to be present. All the other things, the work, the routines, the gestures, they were meaningless without that. I had learned, in the hardest way possible, that love isn't enough unless it is felt, experienced, and lived fully. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by his bed, holding his hand, listening to his soft breathing, watching the shadows of the room stretch and shrink with the passing hours. And I promised myself, no, I promised him, that I would do whatever it took to rebuild the connection that had been lost, that I would not let distance, silence, or mistakes define us. And in that quiet vigil, I realized something else. Heartbreak is not the end. It is a mirror, showing us where we have failed, but also where we can grow. It is a call to presence, to honesty, to love expressed not just in words, but in action every single day. That was the moment everything changed. Not with shouting or violence, but with quiet heartbreak, with revelation, with the unflinching truth staring me in the face. And from that moment, there was no turning back, only the path forward, uncertain, fragile, but filled with the possibility of repair, reconciliation, and, ultimately, understanding. The days after that night were quiet, but heavy with reflection. I found myself watching my children more closely, noticing the small shifts in their expressions, the gestures that spoke louder than words. Every smile, every sigh, every glance carried meaning. And I knew that these moments, fragile as they were opportunities, chances to repair, to connect, to be truly present. I started with small things. Sitting with my daughter at the breakfast table, really listening as she recounted her dreams, her worries, her hopes. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer solutions unless she asked. I just listened, and I could see the relief in her eyes, the way her shoulders relaxed when she knew I was truly there. With my son, the process was slower. He had built walls, carefully and silently, and they were not easy to dismantle. I respected his space, but I also made my presence known. Quiet gestures, checking in without pressure, leaving little notes of encouragement in his backpack. At first, he barely acknowledged them. But gradually, I saw his walls crack, just slightly, and I clung to those small victories, because they meant more than any grand gesture could. One afternoon, I took him to the park, just the two of us. The sky was clear, the sunlight soft and warm. We walked slowly, side by side, and I kept the conversation light, letting him guide it. He talked about school, about his friends, about the small victories of his day. I listened, nodding, asking gentle questions, but mostly letting him feel heard. At one point, he stopped, looking up at me. "Dad, I'm glad you're trying," he said quietly. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start, and I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real, igniting in my chest. My wife and I also took time to reconnect, to ensure that we were aligned in our efforts. We talked openly about the challenges we had faced, about the ways we had failed each other and our children, and about the path forward. It was not easy. There were tears, apologies, moments of doubt. But each conversation strengthened the bond between us, reminding us that love is not static. It requires effort, honesty, and vulnerability. Evenings became moments of reflection and togetherness again. We'd sit as a family, sometimes just watching a movie, sometimes playing a board game, sometimes sharing stories of our day. The laughter returned, softer than before, but more meaningful because it had been absent for a while. The silences were no longer empty. They were comfortable, shared, and filled with understanding. One rainy evening, reminiscent of the night of the turning point, I sat with my son at the window. We watched the drops slide down the glass, the world outside blurred and muted. He leaned against my shoulder, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet peace settle in the space between us. "Thanks for being here, Dad," he murmured. And I realized that presence, consistency, and patience were far more powerful than any words I could have offered before. I also reflected deeply on my own patterns, the ways I had inherited absence from my father, the mistakes I had repeated without realizing it. I vowed to break that cycle, not just for my children, but for myself. I wanted them to grow up knowing that love is expressed through presence, attention, and care, not just words, not just promises. And as I made that commitment, I could feel a quiet strength growing inside me, a resolve to be the father they needed, not the one I had feared I had lost. There were setbacks, of course. A harsh word here, a withdrawn glance there. Moments when I felt the old distance creeping back. But each time, I met it with patience, with empathy, with gentle understanding. I learned to accept that rebuilding trust and connection is a slow process, one that requires humility, persistence, and unconditional love. I also began to notice the small changes in my children. The way my daughter would share a story without hesitation, the way my son would ask a question and wait for my response, fully present. These were not grand gestures, not dramatic revelations. They were quiet victories, tiny sparks that illuminated the path toward healing. Family meals became rituals again. We cooked together, set the table, shared stories, and sometimes argued in ways that were familiar but no longer damaging. I learned to see disagreements not as threats, but as opportunities for growth, for teaching, for understanding. And slowly, our home began to feel alive again, warm and safe, not because the past had disappeared, but because we had faced it together. One evening, as we all sat together on the porch, the sun setting in shades of gold and pink, I reflected on the journey we had been through. The distance, the misunderstandings, the quiet heartbreak, they had been painful, yes, but they had also been transformative. They had forced me to confront my shortcomings, to embrace humility, and to commit to love in its fullest, most present form. I realized that life is not about perfection. It is about showing up, day after day, with patience, empathy, and dedication. It is about recognizing the small cracks before they become chasms, about listening when words are few, about holding space for those we love even when it is uncomfortable. And most importantly, I learned that connection cannot be taken for granted. It must be nurtured, protected, and valued. My children's trust and love were fragile, yes, but they were not lost. They could be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, with intention and heart. I began keeping a journal of small victories, little moments of connection, quiet acknowledgments of love and presence. Each entry was a reminder that healing is incremental, that the effort matters, and that even in the aftermath of heartbreak, hope can be found. I also made time for myself, reflecting on my own emotions, acknowledging my regrets, and forgiving myself for past mistakes. I understood that I could not repair the past, but I could shape the present and the future. And in that understanding, I found peace, a quiet assurance that I was on the right path. The turning point had been devastating, yes, but it had also been a gift, a moment of clarity, a chance to see what truly mattered, a call to presence, love, and intentionality. And as I watched my children grow, as I held their hands, as I shared their joys and sorrows, I knew that we were rebuilding something stronger, more resilient, and more beautiful than ever before. Our family was healing, slowly, patiently, one small act at a time. And in that process, I discovered a truth I had always known but never fully embraced. Love is not measured in grand gestures or perfect actions. It is measured in presence, in empathy, in patience, in the unwavering commitment to be there, fully, every day, through the ordinary and extraordinary moments alike. And so we continued, together, step by step, heart to heart, learning, growing, loving, imperfectly, quietly, but fully. The cracks of the past were still there, yes, but they no longer defined us. They had become part of our story, lessons etched into the fabric of our lives, guiding us toward a deeper understanding of love, family, and the quiet strength that comes from being present for those who matter most. I often sit alone in the quiet moments, late at night, when the world outside has gone to sleep, and I reflect on everything that has passed. The long stretches of ordinary days, the laughter, the tears, the mistakes, the silences, all of it has shaped who we are as a family, who I am as a father, as a husband, as a man. I think about my children, about the walls they built around themselves, and the ways we slowly, carefully dismantled them together. I think about my son's eyes, the day he told me he didn't feel like I was his father, and the heartbreak that followed. I think about the nights I sat by his side, holding his hand, waiting for him to feel safe again, and the small flickers of trust that slowly returned. I've come to understand that love is not measured by grand gestures or the absence of conflict. It is measured in quiet presence, in listening more than speaking, in holding space for others even when it is uncomfortable. It is measured in the small, everyday choices to show up fully, to acknowledge the feelings of those we care about, to repair what we have damaged with intention and care. I think about my daughter, so full of questions and curiosity, and the way she taught me patience simply by existing. She showed me that being present is not just about physical proximity, but emotional availability, about noticing the little things, about responding with empathy, about valuing their inner world as much as the visible one. Even my wife, who bore the weight of our challenges with quiet strength, taught me lessons I hadn't fully appreciated until we faced the storm together. I learned that partnership is not about perfection, but but about shared responsibility, about forgiveness, about showing up for one another even when we are tired, frustrated, or unsure. I reflect on the mistakes I made, the days I prioritized work over presence, the moments I overlooked small cries for attention, the times I let silence grow instead of asking, "How are you really feeling?" I do not dwell on guilt as a punishment, but as a teacher. Those mistakes were painful, yes, but they forced me to learn, to grow, to understand what it truly means to love. Life is fragile. I have felt it in the quiet absences, the sudden distance, the fear of losing those I hold dear. And I have learned that time does not wait. Children grow, days pass, moments vanish. The ordinary routines that feel so abundant are precious precisely because they are fleeting. I treasure them now in ways I could not before, knowing that every shared meal, every conversation, every quiet evening together is a gift. I have also learned that healing is not linear. There are setbacks, moments when the old distance creeps in, times when frustration or misunderstanding threatens to undo progress. But these are not failures. They are part of the journey, opportunities to reaffirm connection, to practice patience, to demonstrate love in action rather than words alone. I often revisit the rainy nights, the evenings on the porch, the soft conversations in dimly lit rooms, the moments that taught me how to truly see my children. Those moments are now imprinted in my memory as reminders that love is patient, resilient, and most powerful when it is quiet, consistent, and real. I think about forgiveness, not as something grand or heroic, but as something gentle, practical, and necessary. I forgive myself for the absences of the past. I forgive my children for the frustration and anger they expressed, expressions of a need that went unmet. I forgive the world for the distractions that constantly pull us away from what matters. And in that forgiveness, I find peace. I reflect on presence, on noticing the subtle cues, the unspoken words, the small gestures that often carry more meaning than anything else. I have learned to pay attention, not just with my eyes, but with my heart. To listen not just to what is said, but to what is left unsaid. To hold space without judgment. To accept that connection is a process, a delicate thread that must be nurtured daily. There are mornings now when I wake to the sound of my children's laughter, and it feels like a balm to the soul. Even in moments of frustration or disagreement, there is an underlying trust, a connection that has been rebuilt slowly, carefully, and with intention. I watch them grow, and I realize that my presence, consistent and patient, has given them a foundation of safety, understanding, and love that I once feared I had lost forever. I think about the quiet victories, a smile after a long silence, a shared joke, a story told at the dinner table, a hand held in comfort. These moments are not dramatic, but they are profound. They are evidence that healing is possible, that love endures, and that even the deepest cracks can be mended with care and persistence. I also reflect on life beyond my family, the friends, the small community around us, the people who witness our struggles and our triumphs. I have learned to appreciate the subtle ways we impact one another, the gentle ripple of attention, empathy, and kindness. Life is not just about avoiding mistakes. It is about responding when mistakes occur, about building bridges when distance forms, and about nurturing connection wherever possible. Even in solitude, I carry these lessons. I sit in quiet reflection, aware of the fragility and beauty of life, the impermanence of time, and the depth of the bonds we share. I have learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to navigate it with grace, empathy, and commitment. I remember the moment of revelation, the day my son told me I wasn't really his father, the fear of losing him, the quiet heartbreak that followed. That moment will always remain with me, not as a source of shame, but as a guide, a reminder of the stakes of presence, of the necessity of noticing, of the profound responsibility we carry as parents, partners, and humans in a shared life. And now, as I watch my children grow, as I hold my wife's hand in quiet evening moments, as I sit in reflection late at night, I know that life's true measure is not perfection, nor success, nor achievement. It is the love we give, the attention we offer, the care we invest in one another, and the quiet, consistent effort to be fully present in the lives we touch. I have learned that forgiveness does not erase pain, but it lightens its weight. I have learned that connection requires patience, empathy, and action. I have learned that even when hearts break, even when distance grows, the threads of love can be rewoven with care and intention. And above all, I have learned that presence is everything. To truly see, to truly hear, to truly be there. These are the gifts that matter most. They are the legacy we leave, the foundation we build, the quiet triumphs that define a life well lived. I often sit with my children now, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation, always in presence. I watch their faces, noticing the smallest changes, the subtle joys, the unspoken emotions. And I realize that love is not a static thing, but a living, breathing practice, something we nurture, protect, and grow each day. The past is a teacher, the mistakes are lessons, and the quiet victories are treasures. Life is fragile, beautiful, fleeting, and in recognizing this, I have found a peace that is deep, quiet, and enduring. I have learned that sometimes, love means letting go of expectations. Sometimes, it means being patient, gentle, and fully present. Sometimes, it means facing our failures and using them as guides to build a better path forward. And so I continue, not perfectly, not without doubt or struggle, but fully, with heart open, presence constant, and love unwavering. For in the end, it is presence that matters. It is love lived in quiet, steady ways. It is the everyday care, attention, and empathy that shapes a life worth living, a family worth cherishing, and a legacy worth leaving. We cannot rewrite the past. We cannot undo mistakes. But we can walk forward with grace, with awareness, with intention. And in doing so, we discover that healing is possible, connection can endure, and love, true, patient, unwavering love, is the force that carries us through even the darkest moments. And as I sit in the quiet of the night, listening to the gentle breathing of my children, watching the soft light spill across the walls, I know this. The journey of presence, patience, and love is never-ending, but it is worth every step. For it is in these quiet, ordinary moments that life reveals its deepest beauty, its truest meaning, and its most enduring truth. Love is everything.